In 1905, Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, who was not a strong leader. Russia was slowly sinking into a hole of depression, famine, and political mistrust. For example, the former serfs of Russia's farms now owned their land according to the Peasant Emancipation of 1861, but many had no idea whose land was whose and what to do with it. By now, Russia was starting to industrialize, albeit much later than the West, and many of the peasants had moved to the cities expecting a better way of life. Boy, how wrong were they? The rich upper class, or bourgeoisie, who owned the factories treated their workers like garbage because they knew that workers couldn't do anything about it. This angered the new labor force and would force Russia into a new direction.
The Russo-Japanese War was a battle between the strengthening Japanese Empire and the crumbling Russian Empire. Even though the Russian Empire was slowly weakening under the leadership of the Tsar Nicholas II, it was expected to win due to sheer numbers. However, the Japanese were much more organized and launched a surprise naval attack that destroyed the entire Russian fleet. The Russian army was ill-equipped and lost many land battles during the war with Japan. Lack of leadership proved costly, and the Russians surrendered after just 1 year of fighting. They were forced to sign the Treaty of Portsmouth, which gave Japan all of Russia's eastern bases. These were humiliating losses to such a small country as Japan, and Russia began protesting against their own Tsar. This event was one of the main sparks of the Revolution of 1905. In early 1905, after Russia lost the war to Japan and signed the Treaty of Portsmouth giving Japan its eastern military bases, the Tsar was at an all-time low in approval. Many resented him, and finally people started to put the wheels in motion and start a revolution. Although it started out as a peaceful protest, Bloody Sunday turned out to be anything but. The crowd, led by Eastern Orthodox holy man Father Gapon, was fired upon by the Tsar's Imperial Guard. This mass killing of between 96 and 4,000 people, depending on which source you believe, undermined the Tsar's leadership to the point where many thought revolution was the only way to fix it. In 1917, General Kornilov attempted to take over the provisional government led by Kerensky. Kerensky, realizing this threat, armed many Bolsheviks to fight off Kornilov. After Kornilov was repelled, the Bolsheviks now had the numbers and weaponry to take over, and quickly took many government facilities with little resistance. The provisional government was formed when 12 members of the Dumas disobeyed the Tsar and tried to force him to abdicate. Nicholas II did eventually give up the throne when the leading generals of the army informed him that he had no longer had their support. The provisional government attempted to take over power after the Tsar had abdicated, but they were forced to share it with the Petrograd Soviet, a political party that contained the Bolsheviks. The provisional government failed when they decided to continue the war, a terrible mistake that caused riots throughout Russia's major cities. They were forced to give all their power to the Petrograd Soviet, which divided it amongst all the Soviets in which the party controlled. Lenin had been exiled to Switzerland for his revolutionary ideas, but he took another chance when the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet were struggling for power. The Germans sent him in a concealed train all the way back to Russia in hopes that he would be able to take the power and immediately call an end to the war. When Lenin arrived in Russia, he outlined a new set of policies for the Bolshevik leaders in the Petrograd Soviet to follow. This policy was called the April Thesis. It encouraged all soldiers to desert No more cooperation with the provisional government. Industry must be put under the workers' control. Land and banks must be nationalized, and a new communist international must be set up to spread communism outside of Russia. Lenin's famous slogans, peace, bread, and land, and all power to the Soviets, encouraged Russian people to vote for the Bolsheviks and to confront the provisional government. A violent riot broke out, but the provisional government's troops were able to fight it off, killing 400 people in the process. They immediately called the Bolsheviks traitors. Lenin was almost captured, but instead managed to slip into Finland. There he remained until the Soviets became much more popular after defeating General Kornilov, who also attempted to seize power. Lenin immediately took over power upon his return and announced two decrees. The first decree was to divide land equally between the citizens. The second decree was based on peace, which put a sudden stop to the war. This decree angered Russia's allies, Britain and France, who would find the more difficult with the war on only one front. War communism was a strict economic system that existed in Russia during the Civil War. This system banned private trade, took food produced by peasants to feed poorer towns and the Red Army, and nationalized all factories, workshops, etc. The terms were harsh, but Russia was beginning to turn into a true communist state. It was not popular with the Russian people, and many died from the riots and the famine that had been caused. Eventually, it was replaced by Lenin's new economic policy, which was similar, but much more successful. The occupation by the Bolsheviks was not accepted by everyone. The White Army fought against the Red Army of the Bolsheviks, and they fought on many fronts. The Whites were also supported by the Allied countries, as they were afraid of the spread of communism. However, the White Army was not organized. In its leadership or military, and were defeated by the Red Army under the Bolsheviks. The new economic policy was formed by Lenin when he believed that the war communism policy was too harsh on the people and that it should be stopped. Lenin's new economic policy was enforced to prevent the Russian economy from collapsing. The policy permitted private trade, peasants were allowed to sell their surplus food, and small factories went under private ownership again. The five-year plan was created by Stalin because he feared that the Soviet Union's power was falling behind that of the strong Western nations. The plan was very demanding, as it wanted industrial targets almost doubled. All Soviet workers were expected to be putting in their best efforts. Those that didn't were severely punished. Although the five-year plan put quite a toll on the people of the Soviet Union, it was largely successful, and the nation immediately became more modernized. Stalin went on to create another five-year plan that was as successful as the first, and in doing so transformed his country into one of the powerhouses, along with Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and the United States. During Stalin's rise to power, he inevitably developed many enemies. To become the leader of the USSR, he had to first remove Trotsky. Trotsky was believed to be the successor to Lenin, but Stalin quickly turned the government against him. He was soon expelled from the Communist Party, along with Zinoviev. Although he tried to escape from Stalin, Stalin's reach was too great, and Trotsky was assassinated in Mexico. Stalin also knew that he had many enemies in the government, some of whom tried to limit his authority, and he had them arrested, tried, and executed. Nearly all of the Bolsheviks who played a role in the 1917 revolution had been executed. Stalin also removed many officers of the Red Army, fearing that they were supportive of Trotsky and not himself. Stalin also killed the kulaks, or the better-off peasants, who resented the ideas of collectivization. On the road to war, the USSR began worrying about its defenses and chances in battle if the Germans were to keep advancing through the process of appeasement. Stalin attempted to reunite with the Soviets' old allies, but the British were worried of the Communist states' intentions. Unexpectedly, a treaty called the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed, making Germany and the Soviet Union allies for the very first time in history. This pact would make it a lot more difficult for the Soviet Union's former allies, who would be matched up against the powerful German armies that would only be fighting on one front.